All right, I have officially wrapped up Chapter 5 in Fire in California's Ecosystems, and I would say this was one of my favorite chapters of the textbook so far. It was all about fire regimes. So if you haven't watched any of my previous videos that I was talking about fire regimes and diving into the details throughout this week, I'll try to do just a quick summary of some of the key things that I learned. First question would be, what is a fire regime? Fire regime is the characteristic or the typical kind of fire that you see within an ecosystem. And this can be a pattern that has been slowly evolving over maybe decades or possibly even centuries to thousands of years. And just like when temperatures get warmer, maybe your plants will move north, and then when temperatures get cooler, your plants will move south. And your ecosystem and all of your plants and maybe how the water moves and how the soils change, the whole ecosystem kind of evolves with itself and changes and adapts depending on different conditions. And I would say the key thing that I learned throughout this chapter is that fire isn't something separate from that ecosystem. It's actually a part of the ecosystem. So you might say, okay, we have coastal redwoods in the Santa Cruz Mountains because it's a moderate climate there. We get a lot of fog from the ocean, and it's very warm, but it's not too warm. And then we get a large amount of rain each year, and there's some creeks that come through. It's a moist environment, and that's why those plants are able to survive there. They have evolved with that ecosystem, and they're adapted to that ecosystem. But what's a very interesting idea put forward in this last chapter is that it's not like you have that set up and then fire is some disruptive force that comes through and just destroys coastal redwoods or destroys the environment. Fire is actually just like those other variables I was talking about. It's just like temperature, the amount of rain you get, the type of soils you have, whether you have fog or not. It's a part of the ecosystem, and especially in California, and that is something I should always clarify. California is, the textbook's called Fire in California's Ecosystem, so I'm not exactly sure if everything I'm saying is true in other ecosystems as well, but I imagine it's true in most Mediterranean climates where California is a natural part of the environment. So just I think better example would be kind of stemming off of coastal redwoods. They're very related to giant sequoias, and sequoias have obviously evolved with certain temperatures, certain amounts of rainfall, certain soils, but they've also evolved with fire. So fire comes through an area, clears out a lot of the vegetation, but the giant sequoia is fine because it has some natural defenses. It has fire-resistant bark. It engages in self-pruning, meaning its lower branches will fall off so that when the fire comes through, it doesn't light the canopy on fire. It just kind of goes around the fire-resistant bark. And then the cones from a giant sequoia won't open up until a fire comes through, and then the seeds germinate and start sprouting. Hopefully I used all the right ecology terms right there. But you see how that works. It's not like fire is just a disruptive force to the otherwise perfect ecosystem that the giant sequoia would be in. Fire is a part of that ecosystem. And in some cases, the plants actually rely on fire because they've adapted with it. They have certain defenses and offenses when it comes to fire. And I'll get more into what fire regimes are in a second. I'm just going to continue on this tangent because I think these were some of the coolest ideas that I learned in this last chapter. And this one especially. So I was reading about severity, and that's one of the characteristics for a fire regime. Actually, you know what? I'll lay down the basics of what a fire regime is first, and then severity is one of the last ones. So then I'll go into this example. So fire regime, that's the typical pattern of fire that you have in an environment. So then you might ask, well, how do you characterize that? Because it'd be tempting to say, oh, all fires are the same. It's just really hot and it just destroys vegetation. But as with anything, the more you learn, the more you realize that things are a lot more complex and maybe not as simple as you had once hoped, which unfortunately means that the problem is more complex, which means your solutions are going to be complex. But ignorance may be bliss, but if you actually want to solve problems in a way that is helpful, then knowledge is good. Otherwise, good intentions can actually lead to bad results. So, what is a fire regime? Typical fire that you have in an environment. How do we characterize it? It's going to be 3 main categories split up into 7 different branches. So the 3 main categories of a fire regime are temporal, spatial, and magnitude. So time, space, and you'd think, yeah, magnitude's a good word right there. So for temporal, that is going to be the seasonality and the fire return intervals. So seasonality just means, when do you typically see fires within that ecosystem? Do you usually have maybe spring, summer, and fall, like some desert ecosystems where the plants are always dry enough where you could have fire almost all year round? Or is it like a typical California setup where it's mostly summer and fall fires? Or is it like the chaparral down in Southern California where it's mostly late summer and then into fall as those offshore winds pick up and the fuels are all still very dry? So that's seasonality, and how that relates to what I was talking about earlier, where it's important to understand fire regimes if you actually want to help the environment, is so for seasonality, you might think, okay, we want to clear out some of the fuels in the chaparral in Southern California, especially maybe creating a fuel break around houses. But we don't want to do it at the peak of the fire season because that would be too dangerous. So we're actually going to do it in the prescribed burn in spring. But the plants in the chaparral have evolved for fires to be happening in late summer and fall. And that's where what their natural adaptations are going to be built into. So then if you do a prescribed fire during spring, maybe you end up burning out all of the flowers that are being produced on the chaparral or on the chamise at that time, or all the fresh new growth that is happening at that time, or you disrupt the soils in some way because the fire is happening at a different time than the natural fire regime. So then, in wanting to kind of help things and thinking you're doing it in a good way, you might actually end up hurting things. Now, obviously there's trade-offs with everything, but that's just where more knowledge helps us make the best decision. So there's seasonality and then fire return interval. And I think this is the clearest example of why understanding fire regimes is important if you actually want to be part of the solution to California. And this was something that I was hoping to learn more about in this chapter, and I did, because this was something that about 6 months ago to a year ago, I was reading another textbook on the California chaparral, and I was going through the fire section, and I realized that I had kind of been saying the wrong thing for a long time. Even in some of my wildfire forecast videos, if you go back and watch some of my old ones, you can probably just hear me saying, oh, this is the solution to fire in California. This is what we have to do. But unfortunately, I wasn't thinking of the problem. I generalized the problem. So then my solution was too simple. And then that solution, if people had followed my advice, that's why I'm hesitant to ever give advice, because I know how much I don't know. And the more I learn, the more I realize how much I don't know. But if people were to follow my advice, then it would actually have hurt the California ecosystem. So what I'm talking about here is I've viewed in the past that, okay, the problem is that we're having more extreme wildfires than ever before. Why are we having this problem? Well, the fuels have accumulated because we view fire as the enemy, and we put out fires too fast, and we're not allowing fires to happen, so then fuels accumulate, and then that leads to larger, more extreme fires. Okay, so what's the solution? More fire. We need to fight fire with fire. We need to do more prescribed burning and restore California back to its more natural ecosystem, clear out a lot of the fuels that haven't been allowed to burn with our war against fire. Now, overall, I'm still mostly in that camp, but I now have a much more nuanced approach to this problem because I realize that that answer isn't going to be true for everywhere. Or it might still be true, but on different timescales. So that's where the temporal aspect of fire regimes comes in. So the example I'm talking about here is with the giant sequoias that I mentioned earlier, where the fires come through, they clear out the fuels. If you don't, and that would typically happen every 5 to 15 years. So up where the giant sequoias are, it's up in the mountains, you get a lot of orographic lift, so you get a lot of thunderstorms, which means you have a lot of lightning, which means a lot of fire ignitions, which means a lot of fires that can come through, clear out those fuels. Now, that means that those plants evolved with a fire return interval of about every 5 to 15 years. So they almost like that fire return interval. You could view it that way. So when we come in and we put out fires as fast as we can, and then the fuels accumulate for maybe 20 years, 30 years, 40 years, now all of a sudden a day is just too extreme, it's too hot, too dry, too windy, and the fire takes off, and it starts a massive fire that burns with such high intensity that the fire severity ends up being much worse than it otherwise would have been. And then the giant sequoias, which would have been fine in the past with that little 5 to 15 year surface fire that comes through, are now overwhelmed. The fire is so big it goes up into the crown and the giant sequoias are destroyed. The fire resistant bark isn't resistant enough to this fire that's so extreme because the fuel's accumulated, and the giant sequoias go into that category of plant mortality after a fire because we interrupted the natural fire return interval. So if you were to take my initial idea there about prescribed burning is the answer, allowing fire to happen is the answer, with constraints. Obviously, if a fire is going towards a community or threatening life and property, then we stop it, no questions asked, obviously. You mostly want to just allow fire to happen when the conditions are favorable and it looks safe. Easier said than done, I'm sure. But we do have some good technology that helps us out with that now. So in the giant sequoia environment, you'd want to have fire maybe every 5 to 15 years. So if it's been 30 years, fuels are starting to accumulate too much, you should definitely put a little prescribed fire in there, try to return it back to that natural fire regime that the giant sequoias like. Now, let's go to the chaparral on the Central Coast. Chaparral, or the Central Coast in general, has the lowest amount of lightning in the entire United States. So the plants here would have evolved with very long fire return intervals, and especially in the chaparral. So, or not especially in the chaparral. I just imagine maybe higher up in the mountains, you would have maybe more ignitions because that is where thunderstorms would be, but we'll just keep it simple. So chaparral, typical fire return interval, maybe 30 to 70 years. And the plants in the chaparral are adapted to that fire return interval. So unlike the giant sequoia that wants fires to come through very consistently to clear out the fuels, in chaparral, it actually kind of likes that longer fire return interval, so it has time to do two things. It has time to drop a lot of its seeds into the soil and build up a really strong savings account, you could think of it that way, in its seed bank. And then it also likes to put a lot of reserves in its burl, which is underneath the ground, and that's something that can re-sprout after the fire. So that takes a lot of time. Maybe it builds it up for 40 years. Fire comes through. The seeds, just like the giant sequoias, kind of pop into action after a fire comes through. So those sprout. The burl, maybe the entire top of the plant looks like it was destroyed, but then the burl re-sprouts, and the plant you thought was dead can actually just rise again, almost like a phoenix. And then the chaparral has cleared out a lot of maybe the non-native plants that weren't adapted to this kind of fire regime, and then it's able to thrive again because it had just this perfect setup waiting for another fire to happen, and then it pops into action. Now, if we were to take the fire return interval from the giant sequoias and bring it into the chaparral on the Central Coast, like I originally thought would be a good idea to clear out some fuels, it would actually just eliminate the chaparral on the Central Coast, because it takes time for that seed bank to fill up. It takes time for the reserves in the burl to fill up. So if you have a fire, maybe those seeds resprout, the burl resprouts, and then they're starting to grow. But then if you think, okay, it's been 5 years, let's put another fire on the ground, and you have another fire come through, that plant hasn't had time to build up its savings account in its seed bank again, and it hasn't had time to restore its reserves and its burl, so then it just clears out all the new resprouts, and since there's no backup, then the plant is just completely wiped out. So, good intentions, thinking prescribe fire, good idea, reduce fuel. Wrong fire regime can mean bad results that you didn't intend. So, definitely talked a bit too long about those, but those were some of my favorite ideas that I've come across so far. So that was temporal. Again, seasonality, fire return interval. Next is spatial, and that's going to be fire size and spatial complexity. And I'll just go over this one really quickly, because this one's pretty simple. Fire size, that's basically your fire perimeter, and that's different than burned area, because not everything in your fire perimeter will typically burn. You'll have maybe an unburned area, you call it an island, and then maybe an area that burns with high severity, so everything's burned, and then low severity, and then you have these little patches. And the smaller those patches are, the more complex it looks. It's almost like a smaller checkerboard pattern, or it's maybe more like a puzzle. The higher its spatial complexity. And then you imagine, depending on the typical fire sizes and the typical spatial complexity in an area, the plants would have evolved differently. And then you can also actually, I haven't brought this up, but the animals actually evolve differently as well, because the animals are part of this ecosystem as well, because they rely on the plants. So maybe just one example there. If we were to take an environment that was supposed to have very high spatial complexity, so lots of those little patches, where it's maybe one area burned 5 years ago, because, yeah, that burned 5 years ago, but then right next to it, which was technically in the fire perimeter, it was an unburnt area, so then that maybe hasn't burned in 30 years. And then another area is maybe 15 years. So if we were to go through and just burn everything, then everything would just go back to square one, and then everything would start growing together. But that could actually be harmful to the environment if that environment was used to having a very high spatial complexity. And the reason for that is there's different animals that are adapted to different stages of those plants. So maybe when there's lots of seeds being produced, that's when maybe all the mice come in and have the seeds. Or another example I know is deer really like it when there's an unburnt area next to an area that hasn't burned in a while, because they can go into the unburnt so a burned area next to an area that hasn't burned in a while. Because in the burned area, you'll have those little sprouts coming up, and they'll come in and eat some of the sprouts. But then if they feel like a predator's close by, they can jump into the area that has all the high vegetation, and it provides them with some cover. So deer like that spatial complexity right there. But it's pretty cool. I've seen a diagram of this where there's almost like migrations of animals within the different patches or mosaics that they're specifically evolved to. So we'd want to understand the typical fire size, the typical spatial complexity. So then if we were to reintroduce fire into the environment to maybe try to clear out some fuels, we would hopefully do it in a way that mimics the natural ecosystem so that we don't disrupt all of those patterns, both with the plants and the animals. So we've talked about temporal, spatial. Last one here is magnitude. And this one, I'll be honest, I was a little confused at first, because the three categories are fire line intensity, fire severity, and fire type. And I was kind of thinking, what's the difference between intensity and severity? That sounds like the same thing. But intensity is more about the flame lengths that you have on the fire, so how tall the actual flames are from the base to the tallest tip. And then how much heat's coming off the fire, how much energy is coming off the fire. That's going to be your intensity. And then your fire severity is going to be more the impact that it has on plants. So low severity means none of your mature plants die. Maybe it's just some of the grasses burn. And then high severity could be most of your mature plants look like they're wiped out, but then they're still able to resprout. And then like very high severity would be pretty much everything's wiped out. So and then the last one, fire type, is basically whether in this environment you typically would have more surface to passive crown fires. Passive crown fire is where you have individual torching, or if it's more passive crown fires to active crown fires. Active crown fires when you have a surface fire connected with the crown fire and then that's moving through. Or it's active crown fire to independent crown fire. That's another characteristic here. Independent is when you have a surface fire below, a crown fire above, but they're not connected. And the crown fire is basically moving on its own, and it's moving faster than the surface below. Those are a bit more rare. And then the key thing I should say, I think that's a pretty good, key thing I should say is that I didn't want to add too much complexity, but you can also actually mix and match a lot of these. Like you could have two of these characteristics in the same environment. So maybe you have low severity fires that burn at a low intensity very frequently, so with a short fire return interval, along the ground, so your surface fires, and those happen maybe every 10 years, but then in the same ecosystem, you could almost have a second fire regime where maybe you have very high intensity, high severity crown fires that come through every 50 years, or whenever the trees get dry enough for that to happen, or they become continuous enough for that to happen. So didn't want to add too much complexity, but you can actually mix and match some of these, and you can have multiple kind of layers of fire regimes in the same area. Won't get too far into that because I'll just save a little time right here to talk about my next favorite idea that I learned, and it was in this magnitude section. And this is still just kind of an idea. I want to research more to see if this is actually true. But when I was talking about the high severity fires, so I was talking about, I already mentioned this before, the chamise, where the chamise has its natural defenses. It builds up the seed bank, it has its burl, and then it's able to resprout after those high severity fires. So those fires could wipe out a lot of maybe the non-native vegetation that aren't evolved to that ecosystem, or maybe even some of the vegetation that are evolved to fire, but maybe not as evolved as the chamise is. So I just started to think about the fact that, okay, so we know the chamise has some natural defenses. It's seed bank, the burl, but what if the fact that you have such high severity fires within the chamise or the chaparral ecosystem is actually part of an offensive adaptation from the chamise? So by this, what I mean is, so your fire definitely impacts your fuel, but your fuel also impacts your fire. So you can't really have fire without fuel, and your fuel is going to adapt to that fire. But what I'm trying to say is perhaps the chamise plant maybe becomes extra dry on purpose, or it's extra flammable on purpose, so that there will be very high severity fires in that area, because it's almost like it knows when a huge fire comes through that just wipes everything out, it actually won't wipe it out because it has these other defenses, and then it will be able to resprout when all the competition has just been destroyed. So I almost started to wonder if the fact that chamise has such high intensity fires, I wonder if that is actually an adaptation of chamise, and it's almost on purpose. So hopefully I'm putting this idea forward correctly, but it's an interesting concept. Like you you would usually think, oh, plants, they want low severity fire, and they certainly don't want big fires to happen. But some of our California plants may actually be promoting the exact extreme fires that we think are so bad for those plants. So I'm going to look more into that. I think that's an interesting idea, though. But the overall idea here with fire regimes is that it has a lot to do with land management. So obviously, at the end of the day, the most important thing is human life, human property. And when a fire is threatening those, if a fire is threatening life and property, then stop the fire as well as we can. But anytime there's a day where maybe the conditions are mild, it's not that hot, not that windy, not that dry, if a fire were to start, it wouldn't be that extreme. We should be putting as much fire on the ground as possible, as long as it matches the fire regime. So, two little things to get into there. Why as much fire as possible? So, the reason that we'd want to do that is because the California ecosystem is meant to burn. Like I said, fire is as much a part of the California ecosystem as temperature, as rainfall, as soil, you name it. And it's not a matter of if something will burn, but when it's going to burn. And the kind of scary thing about California is, since a lot of these plants are adapted to burn, if we don't allow them to burn, they just continue to accumulate, and it's actually not healthy for those ecosystems. It kind of gets them out of balance. And the way nature gets itself back into balance is kind of snapping things back, which would mean a more extreme wildfire in the future. And that's the key point I'm trying to put forward here. If we don't put fire on the ground, the fuels accumulate, and then you end up just with a more extreme wildfire in the future. And that's not only because you have more fuel, but we pretty much know, and my own research under the Fire Weather Research Laboratory showed this, that California is just getting hotter, just getting drier. We have more days per year where we cross into those dangerous thresholds. The fire season's getting longer. So there's more days where we could have extreme fire. And the farther we go off into the future, the more of those days we're most likely going to have. So the more fuel we can burn today, the less fuel is going to burn tomorrow. And tomorrow it's going to burn a lot more extreme than it's going to burn today. Obviously, by tomorrow, I'm talking about maybe 20, 30 years down the road. So it's almost like doing what's more difficult in the present moment for what's actually right and sustainable and good in the long term. But then the second part of that is not, so the first part is put as much fire on the ground, but then the second part is within the natural fire regimes. So we have the idea of, fire is good, let's reduce fuel. However, we want to do it in a way that mimics the natural ecosystem and the natural fire regimes. Because if what we're trying to do is live in more balance with nature and kind of live with fire, then obviously we don't want to destroy the ecosystems that we're trying to help. For example, like if you did prescribed fire in the chaparral every 5 years, it would be completely wiped out. If you did no prescribed burning in the giant sequoias and didn't allow any fire to happen, then those would be wiped out. So it's understanding each of these individual localized ecosystems and then creating a plan for what we should do based on those local communities. So as tempting as it is to make a big generalization about the problem and then have a simple solution, I know that's tempting because I've done that in the past. The more I learn and the more I research and the more I read this massive textbook, Fire in California's Ecosystems, the more I realize that this is actually a very complex problem, which means there's going to be complex solutions. So the best way to go about it is at as local a level as possible. So I'm never going to sit here and tell different communities what they should be doing. The right answer is probably for individual local communities to come together, hopefully with some expertise within that community, to figure out what the specific plan should be for them, because that might be completely different than what the town down the road should be doing. So yeah, those are just some of the ideas that I've been thinking about as I've been reading this textbook. The next chapter goes into how we actually figure out the fire regimes throughout history, and I'll be curious to read that because I was kind of wondering that, like, how do we know what the fire regime was 100 years ago? That seems like difficult to find out, but it goes into some of the research and analysis tools that we use to actually figure out that information. So if you want to learn more about that, you can stay tuned, and thanks for watching.